David Hyde Pierce stars in Julia on HBO Max. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. David, I've read that you didn't know much about Paul Child when you started the project. So I wanted to ask you two questions on that.
Mhm.
First, what was it about the character in the script that really jumped off the page for you? And second, what was your research process like to kind of discover who this man was in real life?
Yeah. So uh, the I guess the thing that really jumped off the script, the pilot script that I read, was the relationship between Paul and Julia. Um, Two very strong people. Um, I had at that point not realized how long they had been together, what an incredibly rich life they had together before the French Chef ever started, um, and tracing the arc in in the pilot of his sort of skepticism about television into transforming into his love and love for and belief in her that overwhelmed his skepticism about television. I liked that journey. And then once they offered me the part, I went about researching Paul, and he's this extraordinarily complicated man with multiple loves in his life, multiple careers that he had, all kinds of wild things. He was a black belt in judo. He played the violin. He was a diplomat. He was a wonderful visual artist, painter, and photographer. He was a visual artist, even though when he was a boy, his twin brother had blinded him in one eye with some sewing needle game that they were playing. So he just seemed to be someone. He was just fascinating. And maybe most fascinating of all was that he was so in the shadows, sort of of Julia's fame.
Yeah, the relationship between Paul and Julia, as you said, really jumps off the page and off the screen, and it's so rich. And I wanted to ask you about finding your character and kind of developing the character in tandem with Sarah Lancashire's Julia. I mean, she's absolutely incredible in the role, as are you.
Yes, well, thank you. It's a really good question because that is where you find the character, is in the space between the two actors and the two people you're playing. It's something I've had to get used to actually over the years of doing film and this kind of film work and TV work, because in the theater you have time to work together and discover the scenes together and discover each other as people and all of that stuff, so that by the time you open for an audience, the cake is baked. This is a very different process. You do as much research as you can, you do as much preparation of the scenes as you can, but then you have to let it go. And it just, I'm sorry, there are dogs playing in the other room. If you see them, just consider them, and you hear them, it's a sort of an enthusiastic audience. So that moment of preparation and everything explodes just in front of the camera, and you have to, as an actor, allow that to happen. And when you're working with extremely talented people like Sarah, like everyone in this cast, it does.
Yeah, no question. One of the first things that really jumps off the screen about Paul too is just his sheer love for good food and good wine. So I kind of want to ask you maybe an unconventional question about, is there a particular food memory of your own from your travels or from your life that you particularly adore, just like Julia, has that Saulmoniere as, a real important moment in her life?
Great question. Um, There are several. That's really good. The first thing I remember is eating 60 dumplings in multiple takes of the Chinese restaurant scene in Julia. So that isn't necessarily a good memory, although every single one was delicious, which is how I worked through 60 of them. So there's that. Oh, my husband and I, when we were very young, we went to France. We ate. I gotta remember the restaurant. We had an incredible meal at one of the big restaurants there. And I don't even specifically remember the food. I just remember how intimidated we were by the service. We were really young and didn't know what the hell we were doing, and barely spoke the language. But I still can see it. I can still see the wood paneling and everything. It was amazing. So, oh gosh, actually, now that you asked me, I have a lot of memories of food. Oh, and probably most important, my grandmother's uh, pudding that she made for after holidays, because it was a sort of a suet pudding with what was called hard sauce on top, and there was so much alcohol in that sauce that every holiday was a happy one.
Those family memories, right? Those are always the ones that really stand out.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I have to ask you, you mentioned the scene of eating, after all these takes, all these dumplings, and the food on this show is so, I mean, visually evocative for the audience. Talk about, doing those scenes with whether you're testing recipes with Julia and the team in the kitchen, or, that wonderful episode where you and Judith are baking bread. Just so much fun to watch. What's the process like of, working with real food on set, and these, I have to imagine, very kind of complicated and ornate processes of shooting these scenes.
Well, the real hero in that is Sarah, because Sarah came to the show. The very first scene we shot was her making an omelet Julia Child style, which means no utensils. The eggs. She would do the double-handed egg crack, and she would pop the eggs into the pan over the flaming burner and do the swirl that there's no spatulas or anything. Pop it onto the plate and douse it with the chopped parsley. And she's the one who has to handle all that stuff. Of course, we have Christine, our amazing chef, who prepares the food and prepares food at different stages of stuff. But Sarah, in a weird way, it has to do with her gift for physical comedy as well, because physical comedy is all about timing, and it's a lot about being able to multitask, have your brain being various places that you're playing one thing while your hands are doing something else. And in all of the cooking scenes, of course, that's what she has to be doing. And she really, I don't know whether she spends all night the night before doing that. I know she was a sous chef for her mom, who was a very fine cook growing up. So I think that was part of it. But I think we all deal with the food, but she really gets the kudos for the artistry there.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you next, is the physical comedy that you bring to Paul. So many scenes, moving that television in the second episode, measuring out the kitchen, you in that tub in San Francisco. I mean, so many fun, physical comedy, which you've done so well throughout your career. I wanted to ask you about just finding Paul's physicality for this series in particular, and how that kind of compares to your experience on, doing farce on TV or doing stage work.
It's a really good question because I feel like Paul is was fundamentally so much more grounded um, than many of the roles I played. So whenever something like that, physical comedy comes up, of which I've done a lot, making sure that I don't go back to something I've done before, making sure the that in finding whatever the physical business is, that it's got a little bit more sort of bodily weight to it. That he's not a kind of fop in the way that Niles on Frasier was, even though they share many of the same interests and maybe the same snobbishness. They agree. So that's what it is. I just keep reminding myself, sometimes literally looking at pictures of him or thinking of who he was and how athletic he was, and what a physical person he was, that I try to either not lose that, or make sure I find that, even though I'm doing silly stuff sometimes.
Yeah, he is such a grounded character, and I wanted to ask you too about his journey over the season, because we meet Paul at such an interesting moment in his career, or his personal life, I should say. It's about a year after he loses his career as a diplomat, and now Julia's star is really on the rise. So, just wanted to ask you about playing those really conflicted emotions, because you do it so beautifully. I mean, it's on your face at all times, but it's also, the relationship is still so tender between the two of them, but obviously Paul is going through, kind of an emotional, a hard time.
Yeah, yeah. It's so much of that is in the writing, um, and this is the territory where both the writers and the actors are. What's the word I want? Not improvising exactly, but we're playing between the lines. These aren't things that we actually literally have transcript of. Um, there were no cameras in these private scenes, um, but they're just intuitable, and we've all been, I think, in situations. I can say in my career, you have heights of your career, and you have times when it isn't as successful. And even my husband and I have gone back and forth between who's been making more money or who's been more in the limelight. And both things can happen at the same time. You can be supportive and loving and thrilled for someone at the same time that you're envious or kind of feeling down on yourself because you're not in the limelight, or you're not achieving things. And I feel like it's also something that is not restricted to the entertainment world. That I just feel like in any relationship, especially a long-term relationship, there are the connections between you, and there are the things that happen outside, and who has more friends, or uh, which one the dog likes more, stuff like that, stuff you just have to absorb and live with.
Right. You mentioned earlier just the incredible ensemble you're working with on this series, and I have a few questions about some of the other cast members. James Cromwell is a guest star on one of the episodes as Julia's father, and there's a beautiful scene between Paul and her father where Paul kind of laments that her father can't see in Julia what he sees. I just wanted to ask you, not only just playing that scene because it's really wonderful, but also, what is it do you think Paul first saw in Julia that really drew him to her, and what does he still see, because the kind of romantic spark between them is clearly still so evident.
Yeah. Um, well, first of all, the scene with me and Julia's dad, played so incredibly by James Cromwell. I think I've said this before. It's like acting with Mount Everest. It's really, and also he's a hoot. Off camera. I mean, he's a sweetheart and a real sort of uh, environmentalist and activist and stuff. Not at all who he portrayed in the show. So again, the joy of coming together with an actor like that, and getting to play, was great. But also the joy of what the writers gave us, which was all these scenes of conflict and obvious dislike, also borne out by the historic record. And then that one scene of a kind of connection and a kind of even understanding from Paul's part, feeling so condescended to and loathed by the dad and resenting him so much, a window into what was missing from the dad's life. Um, that's great writing. That's great writing. And what was part two of your question?
Yeah, no, just what do you think it was about Julia that what did
Oh
Paul
yes.
first see in Julia, yeah, that really
Well,
sparked?
that actually is documented. Her legs. When he wrote to his brother about this woman he'd met, he kind of didn't get it. In the same way that when she wrote back about first meeting Paul back during World War II when they were in Ceylon, she didn't get it either. She thought he had kind of a big nose and an odd mustache. That was the sum total of her response to him. But beyond that, they came together over food. I think they came together over a sense of adventure. They were then subsequently stationed in China, and they would go on in their off time to like eat exotic, to them weird uh, food of the native cultures, and they shared that love. And then I think the cementing of the bond was when they went to live in Paris, and that's when he introduced her to French food and French cooking and wine and that whole culture. And the door was opened, whatever the curtain parted, something, the light went on for her, something she had not been exposed to before, and then something that they could share for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's very clear on the show too. Okay, I have to ask you about reuniting with BB Newworth too.
Mhm.
You've obviously worked together before on TV, and you've known each other for a very long time in New York, in the theater scene. Um, you have so many great moments over the course of the season, but that one episode in New York, when Paul is stricken with the flu,
Mhm.
and Avis has to kind of look after him. It's so funny but also really heartwarming. I just wanted to ask you about, reuniting with her after, so much time, and how your own relationship with her and all of your past experience helps inform, or really enrich what's on the page for the characters.
Well, it's an interesting situation. First of all, I love Dee and always have, and we had a great time on Frasier. She was on, all 11 years, so we really got to know each other then. And as you say, we also know each other's work in the theater, and we've done benefits together and stuff like that. But the initial relationship between Avis and Paul is a fairly cool one, and so that was its own pleasure of two people who know each other very well and who really adore each other, playing that they don't. And what I think the writers, I don't know that the writers had this in mind from the beginning, but I think as they saw the fun of the kind of frisson between those two characters, and because, and I'm going to give Bibi the credit for this, because even in the scenes where she could be a little tough with Paul, like some scenes in the art gallery, Paul's having his work shown for the first time, and he's really down because he doesn't feel like it's being well received, and those scenes could have been played very archly and kind of in a less friendly way by Avis. But Bibi always found a warmth to it and a care, almost in spite of her character's feelings, that enriched it. So I think that's what led to that episode where we end up basically enacting what I just described, that entire arc in one hotel room, the arc of, oh my God, we're stuck together in a hotel room, is there a God? To really opening up to each other and coming to a kind of understanding.
Yeah, it's beautiful work and so fun for fans of both of you, but especially fans of your work together. It's such a joy to watch. In the season finale, you have a great monologue opposite Julia, where you kind of convince her to return to the French chef and just talk about, the show just represents joy. So I wanted to ask you two things on that. Number one, what is it about Julia Child that you find so joyous? And number two, what is it about doing this show, which I just, watching it, it's such a delight and so comforting. It's such a kind of joyous show. What is joyous about the process of working on this series?
Okay, so your first question was about the actual Julia Child, like what do I
Yeah.
find joyous about her? Well, certainly, her her private life, her personal life, all of that was as complicated as any human beings might be. And one of the things I love about the show is it also explores some of the things that aren't so joyous, because that's life. But the effect she had on the people who watched her and the people who worked with her, there is a kind of, for someone so knowledgeable and sophisticated, there's an innocence and an almost naivete about what she's doing that is very freeing for an audience, very freeing for people watching. She seems to be without pretension. She seems to be very accepting of her own mistakes, of wherever the audience is coming from, um, and one thing that I think is captured by that, a friend of mine said about the show, which sort of goes to the second part of your question. He said, I can't remember the last show I saw where people were actually nice to each other. And that is, in one way or another, the kind of comment I get all the time about this show. It makes people feel good without sort of being a feel good show. It's got tough stuff in it. It doesn't talk down to the audience. In that way, it's a lot like Frasier. But there is something, especially in this times of such division and conflict and tragedy and everything else in the world, of seeing people being there for each other. And sometimes being there for each other, even if that might not have been their first instinct, just allowing each other to be who they are. That is both, I think, very, well, it's a joyous thing to be able to play. It's a great space in which to inhabit as actors. But I also think it's very nourishing for an audience.
Yeah, no question. I think that's spot on. It's such an uncynical show, and the relationships are so beautiful and so joyful. Before I let you go, David, I just have to ask you. Julia's been renewed for a second season. Congratulations. Is there anything? I know the pre-production is happening, and you're probably going to go into production sometime soon. Is there anything you can tease us about what lies ahead in the next batch of episodes?
I can't tell you anything, but I'm sure I'll find out more as we are in France.
Very exciting. Cannot wait to see where the season opens. David Hyde Pierce, congratulations on the first season of Julia, and thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Thanks, David. This was fun.